Sorry for the delay there. About 23 minutes before 10 o'clock. Thank you for tuning in this Friday morning. I don't know if I'm going to tell you something that is absolutely true or not, but I wanted to use a story I heard when I was a kid growing up in New York and use it as a way to introduce our guest to you. I grew up on Long Island, and the island, I guess, in the earlier days before my time, was kind of a getaway for people who lived in New York City. And there are, still to this day, bridges on some of the main roadways that lead east to west from New York City out to Long Island that have low clearance, and which means that trucks can't drive down those roads. And still to this day they can't. Since then, of course, they've built other roads that don't have that problem. But in the early days, apparently these were the main arteries, especially to the beaches on the south shore of Long Island. Okay. The fact that trucks can't get through is not the point. It was buses that couldn't get through. That's the point. And I was told the reason they were built like that is to segregate black from white. Black people were typically poorer and had to take buses. White people were typically richer and were able to drive cars. Now, please remember my little disclaimer at the beginning. What I'm telling you, I can't verify. I don't know if it's true, but I was told that. And later on, when I got older, and I was having conversations, I would repeat that, and I would have friends who would say, "Oh, come on, we were never that way up in New York. That's something in the South." Mm-hmm. And then I moved to the South, and it is true. In the South, obviously there was segregation, and then when integration happened, or desegregation, I guess is what we call it, it created some issues, some problems. I've spoken to some black people who remembered it very well, and their football team was destroyed because right? Wasn't it Howard Middle School?
Yeah, it was.
One of the Howard High School?
Yeah, it was Howard Middle School.
But that was then, this is now, and now we're going to look back on it and see if maybe we were being segregated all over this country, not just in the North or the South, but and deliberately. Richard Rothstein has written this book called The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. Richard is a research associate of the Economic Policy Institute. He's a fellow of the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. He's a fellow of the Haas Institute at the University of California, Berkeley, and he's written this eye-opening book. And it's probably something you may have had a hunch about, but just didn't believe. Richard is going to help us understand it. Richard Rothstein, good morning, sir. What an honor. Thank you for being on the show.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you.
Where are you? Where are you calling from?
Right now I'm on Cape Cod, actually, but I live in Berkeley, California.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you for calling in. Are you familiar with the Long Island story that I just told?
Oh, yes. This is not just a rumor. Robert Caro, in his massive biography of Robert Moses, described exactly what you're talking about, that Moses, when he built Jones Beach and the highways that went to Jones Beach, deliberately made the overpasses too low for buses to come through. Moses did a number of things to keep African Americans in a lower condition and segregated. There was a pool near Harlem, and Moses deliberately kept the temperature of that pool lower than he did in other pools, because he had heard that African Americans didn't like cold water.
Oh my
goodness! So he figured he can keep them from using the pool for that reason. So, yeah, Moses is a key figure in the segregation of the New York area. He, for example, there was a park that runs along the Hudson River, and he put tennis courts and other amenities in the southern part of the park and kept the northern part of the park that adjoined Harlem devoid of those kinds of amenities. So the rumor you heard that's not just an isolated incident.
Okay, so is that something similar to what it was the genesis of the book?
Well, the book is actually about much more explicit federal government policy, state and local as well, but government policy to ensure that every metropolitan area in the country was racially segregated. We have a myth in this country. The Supreme Court has said it over and over again, and it's commonly believed by people across the political spectrum, that every neighborhood, every metropolitan area in the country is segregated by something they call de facto, just by personal choices or private discrimination, or perhaps the steering of real estate agents. That's a myth. In fact, every metropolitan area in the country was segregated, what lawyers call de jure, by government action, explicitly racial, intentional, not hidden. And this history was once well known. That's why the subtitle of my book, The Color of Law, is called A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America, because this was no secret. You mentioned Long Island, perhaps the best known event in Long Island in the mid-20th century was the development of a suburb called Levittown. 17,000 homes just east of New York City in Nassau County. Well, Levitt could never have amassed the capital needed to build 17,000 homes for which he didn't yet have any buyers. The only way he got that capital was by going to the Federal Housing Administration, getting the Federal Housing Administration to guarantee his bank loans for construction purposes, and the Federal Housing Administration made a condition of his loans that he sell no homes to African Americans.
Really?
And the FHA required that he put in in every deed in Levittown a clause prohibiting the owners from reselling to African Americans.
Is that right?
And
wow.
This was not just Levittown. It was suburbs. The entire suburbanization of the country was done in this way, with Federal Housing Administration explicit exclusions from African Americans. Maybe you remember, or some of your listeners remember, a song that Malvina Reynolds wrote, that Pete Seeger wrote, that Malvina wrote and Pete Seeger sung about houses on a hillside made of ticky-tacky, and they all look the same. Well, that was about a subdivision built south of San Francisco, in Daly City, which was also financed by the Federal Housing Administration on condition that no homes be sold to African Americans. So from New York to San Francisco and in every metropolitan area in between, the Federal Housing Administration suburbanized the country with an explicit exclusion for African Americans, keeping African Americans renting apartments in central cities, while whites were suburbanized. And the whites were suburbanized, they were subsidized to do this. When whites moved out of central cities into the suburbs that the Federal Housing Administration created, they could pay less in their monthly carrying charges for those FHA mortgages than they were paying for public housing.
Wow.
In central cities.
So here's the little caveat, or something I can add to what you just said. My dad was a policeman in New York City. My dad was a World War II vet, and after the war, he got the job in the city as a police officer, and bought a home in Levittown. And when I was a child, that's where we lived, in Levittown. In the police department, it was definitely not segregated. My dad worked with a lot of black police officers, but none of them lived in Levittown. And so now you've just explained to me why that is. Because when I'd go into the city and I'd see his coworkers, it was definitely looking different than it did in Levittown.
Well, you're absolutely right. In my book, I describe a family, a black African-American World War II veteran who came back from World War II, reconditioned some surplus Army trucks that he bought, so he was a small businessman, got a contract with Levittown to deliver sheetrock during its construction, but he couldn't live there.
Isn't that something? Wow. So are you exposing something for the sake of history, or are you exposing it because it's still in existence?
Well, it's still in existence. The powerful policies that were pursued by federal, state, and local governments to segregate the country were so powerful that their effects endure today, and these policies were all unconstitutional. And the Constitution requires that they be remedied. It was unconstitutional for the Federal Housing Administration to put this condition on the Levittown development and on all these other developments, and we've never had a remedy. So let me explain to you, if I may, why it's still in effect today. The policies still have such power. Those homes that I guess your dad bought, that your family bought, and that other white returning war veterans bought in around 1950, in the late 1940s, early 1950s, they sold for about $8,000 a piece, $9,000 a piece. In today's dollars, that's about $100,000, or twice national median income. And working class families could buy those homes for $100,000 in today's currency, twice national median income. That's affordable for working class families. Your dad, the that I mentioned before, my uncle, who was worked in a supermarket, were able to live in Levittown. African Americans were not permitted to do that. Well, today, let me just finish this. Today, those homes in Levittown sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. That's seven times national median income. They're no longer affordable to working class families, either black or white. So we passed a law in 1968, the Fair Housing Act, which said in effect to African Americans, okay, you can now move to Levittown or to Daly City or to Lakewood south of Los Angeles or to any of the other hundreds of suburbs like this from which they were excluded. But it was an empty offer, because those homes that were affordable to African Americans at the mid-20th century are no longer affordable to working class and middle class people today. We're not talking about poor people.
Wow.
I'm talking about middle-class families that were prohibited from moving into these suburbs.
Yeah.
And had the FHA not put this condition on Levittown and on all these other suburbs, the black policeman that your dad worked with and the truck driver that I described in my book could have moved there, and we would have had a much more integrated landscape throughout the country than we have today.
I don't know if you're familiar with the Marik and Freeport towns, the two towns of Marik and Freeport, but I grew up, most of my youth was in Marik after we moved out of Levittown, and one town closer to the city was Freeport. In other words, a train ride you could get from one town to the next. Freeport had a movie theater. Marik had a crappy movie theater, and Freeport was mostly black, and Marik was mostly white. I mean, in fact, I would say all white, and Freeport. And not too long ago, in this studio here in Ocala, Florida, I had a young man, a guy my same age. Well, I'm 62. He's about my age, right? And he plays bass guitar. He's a black guy. And we I thought he grew up here, and we were talking to him, and he said, no, I grew up in Freeport. I said, oh my gosh, I grew up in the town next door. And we had this discussion about the white-black divide and how the kids would go, when you're kids, you don't think too much about it, especially if music is your draw.
Yeah, teenagers.
And we weren't allowed. I wasn't allowed to go to Harlem because I was. I guess everybody was afraid of Harlem when you were a white kid. But that was the kind of our experience with the racial divide, was the fact that our towns were clearly separated that way.
Well, you're absolutely right, and it wasn't. Most people believe, as I said a minute ago, and the Supreme Court has said that the reason that Freeport was black and Marik was white was because blacks happened to want to live in Freeport and whites happened to want to live in Marik. Well, It was federal government policy that created that division.
That is
African Americans were not permitted to buy homes in Freeport.
Isn't that something?
I'm sorry, in Marik.
Right. Okay,
African Americans were not permitted to buy homes in Marik.
All right, so this is very coincidental. The other day, I had downloaded one of these 99-cent movies to watch on my Kindle, and it was an old movie about New York. I just wanted to see New York again because I'm, kind of missing New York a little bit, and it was back and before the days of when I was born, and they were talking about how poverty was so bad they had to build these projects in Lower Manhattan. Okay, and I think they're still there. I'm not sure. But they were showing how they were illustrating, and this was an old movie. They were showing how an African American would be on the phone trying to buy property, and the person on the phone could detect he was African American, say, "I'm sorry, we don't have anything," and then a white guy would pick up the phone and speak to the same exact guy. "Oh yeah, we got something, no problem." But then it showed this, and I want to ask you this: was the same discrimination being exercised toward Jewish people? Because in the next scene, they show a guy with like a Jewish last name. I don't know what it might have been. Maybe like your last name is Jewish, isn't it? And so he was also turned down. Was the same discrimination being applied to the Jewish people?
Not the same, similar. There was other discrimination in this country. It's not that African Americans are the only people who've ever been discriminated against, but the discrimination against African Americans was government-sponsored, not simply the act of private individuals. So, for example, the National Association of Real Estate Boards had a clause in its code of ethics which prohibited the sale of homes in white neighborhoods to African Americans. It did not prohibit the sale of homes in white neighborhoods to Jews or to other minorities, even though they may have been discriminated against. And every state regulatory agency that regulated real estate brokers, and every real estate broker in the country is heavily regulated. Every state agency that regulated real estate brokers embraced this clause, making it a form of state action. That it was not that these private real estate agents were simply on their own keeping African Americans out. They were officially prohibited from doing so by their national association, and the state regulatory agencies took no action to prevent this.
So you said, you hinted earlier anyway, that it's still going on today. Is it going on today in the form of making things cost prohibitive?
Right. I don't mean that these government policies are still going on today. They're not. But their effects were so powerful that, as I explained before, they need a remedy. They can't simply go away by themselves simply by passing a Fair Housing Act, because of, as you say, the costs are such now that it's too late to simply tell African Americans they can move into the suburbs that were built in the mid-20th century and from which they were excluded. So they're still excluded from them, but they're excluded from the effects of those mid-20th century policies, not because the policies still exist. Mm-hmm. There are a few African Americans in Levittown today. The New York City population metropolitan area is probably about 15% black, and African Americans now make up 1 or 2, 3% of Levittown's population. So it's not that they're prohibited from doing so, but they were prohibited in the mid-20th century, and most of them have not been able to overcome that because of the effects of those earlier policies, not because the clauses still exist in these deeds, but they're not enforceable.
Was the money that the government dispersed for schools, for example, also unequal?
Well, that's a more complicated question. There have been a lot of lawsuits around the country about unequal funding for schools, but it's not as simple as it seems. There are many places, for example, New York City, which has a very, very large African American population going to schools, but New York City funding is much higher than most of the suburbs around it because it gets federal compensatory funds for education. Okay. Now, they don't get enough. So there's an argument that can be made, should be made, that the funding for schools that are filled with disadvantaged children isn't adequate because they have so many greater needs. But it's not a simple case of that schools that serve disadvantaged children always have less money than schools that serve middle-class children. They certainly have less money than the most affluent schools. But the typical white middle-class community doesn't get as much funding as a typical black inner-city community, simply because the needs are so much greater. The federal government does give them some funds, but not nearly enough to take advantage, to compensate for the greater needs that exist.
Is there any recourse going on now? Because every once in a while you hear people asking their communities to apologize to them for treating them poorly. Had that happened up in those areas too?
Well, an apology doesn't do much to remedy this. What we need is remedies, and the reason we don't engage in the discussion of remedies is because we believe that this happened by accident. And under our Constitution, if this residential segregation happened by accident or happened by private prejudice or personal choices, there is no required remedy. So the reason I wrote this book is to show people, remind people, that residential segregation is the product of government policy, and if it is the product of government policy, then the Constitution requires us to remedy it. So I think we need a much greater awareness of the history to understand the government's role before we can have a really meaningful discussion about remedies. There are some minor remedies being discussed.
Well said. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Today. There are some minor remedies that are being discussed today, not apologies, but minor remedies. There are some efforts to get suburbs to repeal their zoning ordinances that prevent the construction of more modest homes, single-family homes on smaller lot sizes, or with fewer bedrooms, and many suburbs keep moderate income families. I'm not talking about poor people. I'm talking about middle class families. Some suburbs keep middle class families out with these exclusive zoning ordinances, and those could be modified. There's for the lower income families. There was some effort in the Obama administration to try to provide them with vouchers that would permit them to subsidize their incomes to afford to rent apartments in middle class neighborhoods. That policy has been reversed in the Trump administration. So there are some modest policies that are being enacted, but we're not going to be able to really have serious efforts to desegregate unless we understand that we have a constitutional obligation to do so, and that requires knowing this history that I've been describing to you.
Wow.
Good for you.
You're
My gosh.
amazing.
I think this is another important book. The book is called The Color of Law. It's written by our guest, Richard Rothstein, and the subtitle, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. You have really done your work to put this together. And while we've been focusing on the Northeast, Long Island came up a lot, probably because that's my fault. I probably did that. But the book, the whole country was doing this.
It runs the gamut.
Were we doing the same thing in the Southwest regarding the Latinos, the Mexicans?
There was discrimination to some extent regarding Latinos, but as I said before, the extent of government-sponsored segregation of African Americans was much greater. I can give you one example if you have time. Austin, Texas. In 1928, Austin, Texas developed a city plan, which designated an East Side area for African American residents. And it was that was the South, and it was segregated. Texas was part of the Confederacy, and so African Americans were going to different schools, and they had their own libraries and other facilities. And Austin, in fulfillment of this plan, began to close all of the African American facilities elsewhere in the city in order to force African Americans to move to this East Side area. Come the 1930s. The federal government, not the Federal Housing Administration, but the Federal Housing Act in the late 1930s provided for public housing, and Austin built 3 public housing projects. They built one for whites, one for African Americans in this East Side ghetto, and one for Mexican Americans, not far from the East Side ghetto. Mm-hmm. The difference was that African Americans were forced to move to the East Side ghetto. Mexican Americans, they had been integrated throughout the city before that, and many cities around the country, and I described this in the book, had many more integrated neighborhoods than they do today. African Americans were forced to move to the East Side area where the public housing project for them was built. Mexican Americans, if they were in public housing, moved to their public housing project, but they were undisturbed throughout the rest of the city, and so they remained able to live elsewhere.
Richard.
So there was discrimination, but it was much more severe against African Americans, and it was state-sponsored in a way that did not affect others.
Richard, we have to go, but thank you so much for this. I have a copy of the book. Call me if you want it. Richard Rothstein is the author. Do you have a website?
Yes, it's www.epi.org. That's the Economic Policy Institute. And if you go to the top, there's a bar that says experts, which for some reason they've listed me there. And you go down to my name, you'll find lots of articles on this topic as well as a link to this book.
Wow. Thank you so much. What a piece of work. This is awesome. Thank you for being on the air with us today.
Thank you very much.
All right, we'll be right back.
Bye-bye.
Policy is a national security necessity until additional vetting of visa applicants than refugees can be done.
Fox Radio's Jared Halpern. Lower courts have said the policy intends to target Muslims. Fox News, we report, you decide.
My number 2 does not look like a number 2. I don't know what to call it. Is there a number 3?
Table for 4, please. Anything close to the restroom.
Oh, a middle seat with these stomach problems? That's my fear of flying.
Sound like you? If it does, you could be one of the many people with a digestive condition called exocrine pancreatic insufficiency, or EPI. Even if you don't know what EPI is, you might know the symptoms: frequent diarrhea, gas, bloating, stomach pain. If you have even just one of these symptoms, you could still have EPI, because not everybody experiences EPI the same way. which is why it's so important to open up to your doctor about all your symptoms. And the good news is,